All right, hello everyone. I am Liz. You might know me from the Derry Public Library. I do film recommendations every day at 3 p.m. on our Facebook Live page, or if you came to the library in the before time, you might remember me from the reference desk where I would give film recommendations, everything from classic films to cult out-of-the-way movies you can only find free info on YouTube. So this is the first of my film education series, and I'd like to just say a little bit about how I came to film and film education. I am just someone who, at a young age, really took a liking to cinema as an art form and as an entertainment form. And while I have had some formal education on film, I minored on it in college, much of it was self-taught and kind of just finding books, watching movies, seeing interviews, and I feel that this position at the library and these programs, the series, will give me an opportunity to expand people's thoughts on film and also give them history that, we might not have known. I'll say for a fact, I actually was really surprised at doing research on this. I was shocked by some of the movies that were #1 for the year. So just one moment, we're just gonna pull up my PowerPoint. Chair. Alrighty, one moment. All right, so welcome to the history of summer blockbusters. So there's a reason I chose this for my first topic. #1, everyone loves blockbusters. Everyone's seen at least one of them in their lives. And also because I think a lot of people come to an appreciation of film via blockbusters. For me, I couldn't verbalize it at the time or really put it together, but seeing Jurassic Park at 7 was when the magic of cinema really hit me. And I think before, movies had been just an entertainment factor, but I still remember the awe that I felt when I first saw the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. And it is a very, looking back, that moment of realizing the power of cinema, as it were. And as much as some people like to go like, oh, blockbusters ruin cinema, I also think they help bring a lot of people to an appreciation of film. So before we go, blockbusters have always existed in Hollywood. And it's, not specific to the summer. We have Gone with the Wind, which, if you adjust for inflation, is still the highest grossing film of all time. You had The Sound of Music, and you had The Godfather, which, we'll get there, but blockbusters as they are now, I cannot imagine a drama about a mob family being the highest grossing movie that everyone lined up around the block for. Hollywood's always had blockbusters. A quick note on where the term blockbuster came from, and this is from a Time magazine article from February of this year. This actually came from a type of bomb that was used in World War II. The bombs used for such mission were called blockbusters because of their ability to destroy an entire city block. And they kind of worked their way into the American lexicon, and certain movies were called as explosive as a blockbuster. After the end of the war, especially after stuff like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, blockbuster kind of fell out of favor being used. And also in Hollywood, blockbuster in the 1950s and early 60s became associated with movies that cost a lot of money and lost a lot of money. So Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor comes to mind. So that's kind of a little background on where that word comes from. So these movies were, actually another fun fact, 1953 was considered the year of the blockbusters because it had multiple films that grossed over $1 million. That's a bomb now, considering considering how much a movie costs to make. So on to the first blockbuster, the OG blockbuster, Jaws. So quick question for the audience. Who here saw Jaws in the theater? Anyone old enough to have seen it in the theater?
Yep.
Yes.
So yes, revival screenings do count. That's actually something fun that's come out of COVID, is a lot of revival screenings.
Originally.
So, yep, we have an OG viewer of Jaws here. So yes, The Killer Shark That Could. This was a movie that the studios, I don't want to say had no faith in, but they were a little worried about it. obviously, if you've read anything about Jaws, it had a very troubled production. The shark is not in a lot of shots for a reason, which actually helps the movie, in my opinion. But it was based on a book, so Peter Benchley's novel, which it was a well-read book, so they figured, okay, people will see it. And they figured, since it's set during the summer and set on a beach, let's just put it in the summertime. Before Jaws, there was no set time to release a blockbuster. There was no season that was considered good for a high-grossing movie. And if anything, the summer was kind of a dumping ground. It was because people were traveling. So it was where they actually put a lot of low-grade exploitation movies, or movies that just didn't cost a lot so they could easily recoup a cost. So the domestic gross of Jaws, now keep in mind, this is 1975, $260 million. That is how much some movies cost now. And I will say, even now, that is not a bad domestic gross for a film. So the gross adjusted for inflation, we're seeing over $1 billion for a movie about a shark that's terrorizing a beach. And a couple of Guinness World Records. It is the first movie, or I should say first recorded movie, because recording for some older films wasn't the best, and it isn't the way it is now. So it is possible that potentially a movie made more, but a lot of the people who've looked into this don't believe so, but let's leave room for some error. First film to gross over $100 million, and it grossed that in 59 days, which is a record at the time. Also, opened in over 400 theaters. Again, compare this to what we have now. But again, you have to keep in mind, different time, not as many theaters, and, tickets were cheaper then. Also, this is the most interesting part to me. This was the first movie to make use of television advertising, and having TV spots on high-rated programs during the evening. Before that, a lot of advertising was mainly in print. So, I mean, if you know anything about the history of TV, a lot of Hollywood saw TV as an enemy. They didn't really want to work with it, but producers of Jaws were like, may as well advertise this film. So we have Jaws, that comes out, that takes the country by storm. And this was also a movie that just everyone felt they had to go see. And it was similar to something like The Godfather or Sound of Music, where it just had this broad mass appeal and a word of mouth where people heard like, oh my gosh, this movie is so scary, you have to see it. And that's how it got as big as it did so quickly, and ruined swimming in beaches for a good long time. I really feel bad for anyone who worked as a lifeguard in the few years after Jaws was released. So we're going to skip forward to 1977. Now, there was a movie that, was number one for 1976, but it has nothing on this little movie that came out in 1977 called Star Wars. Oh, sorry. I forgot my own slide. So before we go to that, this is Roger Ebert on Jaws, and he talks about how this changed the face of cinema. Spielberg changed the course of modern Hollywood history. Jaws was a hit of vast proportions, inspiring executives to go for the home run instead of the base hit. And it came out in the summer, a season that major studios had generally ceded to cheaper exploitation films. Within a few years, the Jaws model would inspire an industry in which budgets ran wild because the rewards seemed limitless, in which summer action pictures dominated the industry, in which the hottest young directors wanted to make the great American blockbuster. So we're not only going to follow blockbusters here, we're also going to follow a few careers. And I did want to include a quote from Roger Ebert, as he's someone who influenced my perspective on film. So now on to a tiny little movie that took place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Star Wars. So the inspiration for Star Wars is always interesting. This was inspired by stuff like Flash Gordon, old sci-fi serials from the 30s and 40s, and by a very specific film by Akira Kurosawa. And who knows which film influenced Star Wars?
Hidden Fortress.
Yes, you got it. So again, domestic gross for this, for the time in 1977, $461 million, and adjusted for inflation, over $1.5 billion. For a movie that, was not based on, not based on a book, not based on a known property, it just captured the imagination of everyone. And I did want to put this in here because the past couple of years, especially with the sequel trilogy, when that came out, there was a lot of hubbub from internet commentators who shall remain nameless that Star Wars is for boys and why do they have girl heroes? Which, number one, Princess Leia. Number two, I don't think you become the highest grossing and most beloved franchise of all time by not appealing to absolutely everybody. And everyone saw Star Wars. It was like Jaws, a movie that had word of mouth where people were like, you need to see. And with Star Wars, we started to have repeat viewings of it. Usually people would go to the movie only once, maybe twice. Star Wars, you started to have people who would go multiple times, take their friends. They want to experience it with other people. So we're going to go into the 80s, but quickly I want to look over the other films that dominated the summer in the year since Jaws. So we had The Omen, only made $60 million. Again, nothing compared to Jaws. Adjusted for inflation, $257 million, not bad. I think some of that is because a lot of people wanted to see Atticus Finch, the world's most famous father, try and kill a child. If you're not familiar with The Omen, it's a horror movie about a little boy who might be the spawn of the devil. Actually, it's quite good. 1978, Grease 2, $190 million in 78, adjusted for inflation, almost $700. When is the last time a musical film made that much money? The only one I can think is Mamma Mia, and I don't think it grossed that much. And in 1979, the Amityville Horror, that was based on a book and based on I don't want to say a true story because the Lutzes were not truthful about that, but it was still based on a known property, so that kind of had some buzz around it. One second. So on to 1980, The Empire Strikes Back. Domestic gross, not as much as Star Wars, but we still have almost $300 million. And adjusted for inflation, we have almost $1 billion. So, of course, the saga continues, so does the money. And what we saw here, and what studios saw more importantly, was Star Wars and Jaws weren't flukes, that it is possible to have summer be a big earning season. And there was another thing that Hollywood learned from this. It didn't learn that sequels were popular because sequels had already been popular with James Bond. They had actually, I think there had already been a Jaws sequel by 1980. But they learned that franchises could be popular and that they could become tent poles for a season, meaning that's the movie everyone goes and sees. So the lesson that they learned from this is, hey, franchises are great and tentpole series are great. And that is both good, or as we're going to see in some more recent years, not so great. Moment. I do have to check Zoom 1 second. Person in the chat. There we go. Oh, question from Jamie. Didn't The Greatest Showman hit 500 million? Potentially, that is something we would have to check Box Office Mojo for. They are pretty much the site I went to doing a lot of this project, but they are meticulous in terms of keeping box office grosses. So. Ooh, 1 moment. Hang in there. All right, 81, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Feel free to confirm or deny, Mom, but I believe this was another one that you saw in the theater when it came out.
Confirmed.
Yay. My parents were cool once upon a time. So this was similar to how Star Wars was based on the old serials and stuff like Flash Gordon. Indiana Jones was based on old pulp serials and adventure stories, kind of from the similar era, the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So again, this is a new property but the one difference between this and, let's say, Star Wars is Lucas and Spielberg had some name recognition now. So when people heard, oh man, Lucas and Spielberg are teaming up, everyone get in the car, we've got to go see this. And you also had the just undeniable charisma of Harrison Ford and a great adventure story that, again, like a lot of these blockbusters, appeals to everyone. So domestic gross, almost $250 million, adjusted for inflation, almost $8 million. And this kind of also solidified Spielberg and Lucas as the golden boys of Hollywood. That that kind of comes and goes for them. Some of that is a program for another time. I could do an entire program on the Twilight Zone movie, but story for another day. On to 1982. I wasn't shocked by this, but I think the studios were when E.T. the Extraterrestrial just dominated the summer. So this was not only the hit of the summer, this was the hit of the year. And this was also starting to be the trend of Hollywood blockbusters, where whatever was the hit of the summer was the highest grossing film of the year. And E.T. just left everything else in the dust. And this is a great fact I heard on a wonderful podcast. It's no longer being produced, but go back and listen to the episodes. They cover the first 5 years of the 80s. E.T., Blade Runner, Poltergeist, The Thing, and Star Trek Wrath of Khan were all released in June of 1982, and they have all become just, staples of our pop culture. And I'm just like, man, what a time to be alive to see all of those in theaters. Unfortunately for Blade Runner and The Thing, they came out the week after E.T., and it took them a few years to get recognized for the great works that they are. So domestic gross, $435.1 million, adjusted for inflation, $1.2 billion. Also was big at the Oscars that year. And this is actually something you don't see that much anymore at the Oscars, but Star Wars was nominated for Best Picture, Raiders of the Lost Ark was nominated for Best Picture, E.T. was nominated for Best Picture. You actually don't see that much any. I think the last time a big blockbuster film was nominated and won would probably be Lord of the Rings. Maybe, I'd have to check that. Also, this holds the record for the most weeks at number 1, non-consecutive. So this spent in total 16 weeks at number 1. However, there is a movie, it is a blockbuster, but it was not a summer blockbuster that holds the record for the most consecutive in a row weeks at number 1. 15 weeks. Who wants to guess the movie? Does anyone have a guess as to what it is?
I'm going to guess it's either Titanic or Forrest Gump.
It is Titanic. You are correct. And Titanic had the advantage of coming out in the winter, and still kind of is. January, February, March, for the most part, are dead zones in terms of releases. So it had that advantage of there was no real competition. Also, Titanic has, the advantage of spectacle. Whereas you kind of look at E.T. now and you're like, a movie that doesn't have a lot of action, it's just about a little kid and alien. How does that make a lot of money? But the answer is there is a sincerity to this movie and a lot of heart. And for a while, a lot of studios and writers and directors took that to heart when they made their films, when they tried to make the next great blockbuster. Moving on to 83, Return of the Jedi, end of the saga. Total domestic gross, $309 million, $847 adjusted for inflation. And the next highest grossing movie of 1983, which was Terms of Endearment, which, again, a drama about a mother and a daughter, I can't picture that being the number 2 movie anymore. Half of that. And this was the end of Star Wars. So it was, I think there were a couple of studios who were like, Fox were like, oh crud, what are we gonna do now? So move on to 84. And this was one of the shockers because I was pretty convinced it was going to be Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, but it was not. The hit of the summer was Ghostbusters. Once again, a new property that kind of comes out of nowhere and a lot of people love. Also, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom had a lot of controversy at the time for having a much darker tone, being a lot more violent and a lot scarier. There is the, I don't want to say it's the misnomer, but it kind of is that it helped create the PG-13 rating. There was already discussion in the MPAA that they had to have something between R and PG, but I mean, a guy getting his heart ripped out really helped expedite that. I personally love Indiana Jones, The Temple of Doom. It is my absolute favorite indie movie. It has a good horror vibe. It's got a really nice dark quality that I like. It starts with a musical number and it has exploitation movie level violence. It's a movie after my own heart. And yes, that joke is intended. But so for Ghostbusters, Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd were really well known from SNL. So again, you kind of have this sort of built-in cultural recognition for it. And this is also the first time a comedy ruled the summer. It made $242 million. Also spent 7 consecutive weeks at #1. So moving on to 1985 with Back to the Future. So this was a big hit and a big personal victory for the director Robert Zemeckis. So he had had years of flops. I Want to Hold Your Hand, which is about the Beatles, which is a great movie actually. Used Cars, really good comedy. I would never even heard of it if not for 80s All Over, so highly recommend you check it out. Zemeckis got a hit in 1984 with Romancing the Stone, and that was the, I think, only big hit for 20th Century Fox in 84. Again, Star Wars had just ended. So this was what allowed him to make Back to the Future. So, of course, launching stone for Michael J. Fox, $210 million domestically, adjusted for inflation, over $500 million, spends 8 consecutive weeks at #1. So we're kind of going to gloss over 86 and 87. We have Top Gun, Tom Cruise, pretty much the star-making role for Tom Cruise. He had been in a few films before that, but this was his first. This is like the Hi, I'm Here, the first leading role, and also establishing who he was as an actor. Made $178 million, not bad, and also was a big recruiting tool for the US military, something they have been kind of chasing in movies ever since. And in 1987, we have Beverly Hills Cop 2, rated R. Also, like Beverly Hills Cop came out at the end of 84, and that was, I don't want to say a surprise hit because Eddie Murphy was known, but it definitely was one of the biggest hits of the year. So before we go any further, what are we noticing about the target age groups for these movies? Who would you consider to be the target audience overall?
20-year-olds.
20, yeah, adults. You know, 20-year-olds, I would say 30-year-olds a little bit, but definitely not kids. We're actually not going to see a children's film get the #1 until the 90s, but this next movie is in the middle. And this was actually the first big hit for Disney. So Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Big surprise for me in 1988, this being #1. So this was another big hit by Robert Zemeckis. And this also had the appeal of, the big selling point on this was like, you are going to see humans and animated characters interact on screen. It was an incredibly groundbreaking film in terms of animation. Also, considering the subtext of this movie has a lot to do with older Hollywood and segregation, I think it might be the most subversive summer blockbuster of all time, and definitely one I can't see being made today. It also beat out another modern classic, which was Die Hard. So this gets considered to be a Disney film a lot, but it was actually, I believe, released by either Buena Vista or Touchstone, one of their little, the company that they would use to release their more adult-oriented features. But Disney, ever since the late 70s, had been in a real slump. And if you actually look over box office overall for the 80s, they're really not there. They were completely lost after Walt died. They had no idea where they were going as a company. They tried to dip their toe into live action films. They actually tried to make more adult-oriented live action movies. And a lot of the people in their animation department in the early 80s, including Don Bluth, who went on to make a slew of great animated features, they up and quit because they're like, they're making us make awful movies. So while this wasn't officially a Disney film, this is a step back in the right direction for Disney. And, you know, Little Mermaid comes out in 1989, and we all know what happens after that. So to round out the 80s, Batman. So you might also be wondering, where was Superman? Because Superman was released in 79, but that was a September release. And Superman 2 had the misfortune of being released in 1981, which, you know, Raiders of the Lost Ark just said, hi, I'll have that top spot, thank you. So this is the first time a superhero movie dominated the summer. Back in the time, this was unheard of. I mean, we're looking at this in 2020 and we're like, where are all the superhero movies? This was only Tim Burton's third feature, so he was considered kind of an untested director, and his first 2 movies were Pee-wee's Big Adventure and Beetlejuice, certainly not, you know, big budget features. Also, Michael Keaton was mostly known for comedy work, so his casting caused a lot of controversy. kind of similar to Robert Downey Jr. getting cast as Iron Man. That was a pretty, I guess, controversial choice when that was made. So it made 250 million adjusted for inflation, 567 million, beat out Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade by about $50 million. And also, sequels were number one of their respective summers. Although I was very shocked to see 1995 be Batman Forever, I was convinced it was Toy Story, but we will get there. So we're going on to 1990. So 1990, couple movies came out. We had Total Recall. We had Back to the Future 3. Does anyone want to take a guess about what the number one movie of the summer of 1990 was? Because this is probably the most shocking find for me. Anyone who's alive then might know. Nobody? Well, I kid you not when I tell you the number one film of the summer of 90 was Ghost. Yes, that's right, the movie with the pottery wheel. Actually, I think a very good, solid, supernatural romance / murder mystery. I think it's great. Also won Whoopi Goldberg her Oscar. I have to say, I'm not kidding. So it beat out Total Recall and Back to the Future 3. The one thing I would say is kind of missing from the box office haul right now is we're not seeing a lot of romance movies. Top Gun kind of had it. Star Wars does as well, but a film where romance is front and center usually is not the number one film of the summer, not even of the year in many cases. So Ghost really, I don't want to say it's a fluke, but if you look at summer blockbusters, it is definitely an outlier. But I think it goes to show that, you know, there's not one type of person that goes to movies. And if a movie is good and a movie has appeal for enough people, people will go see it. So 1991, Terminator 2 comes out, and James Cameron, I would say the fourth in like the quartet of the big blockbuster makers. We have Lucas, we have Spielberg, we have Zemeckis. Terminator was a hit in 84, a modest hit. Aliens comes out in 86, but Top Gun came out that year. And then he finally gets his big hit with Terminator 2, and he will get even bigger hits, obviously, since we know how history goes. So finally gets a blockbuster. This is also capitalizing on Schwarzenegger at the height of his popularity. So again, we're kind of seeing this trend of sort of trending towards known properties being the biggest hit. So yeah, 200 million. Also, this was a rated R action movie, and I think anyone who knows, the more this goes along, the harder it is for a rated R film to get number one. Moving on to 1993, my favorite blockbuster, Jurassic Park. So I am going to tell a personal story here. I loved dinosaurs like most children, and I begged for at least a few months to see this movie. And one night, my mom says, oh, get in the car, we're going somewhere. And I figured it was ice cream. We pull up to the theater, and I see Jurassic Park on the marquee, and I was just like, oh my God, it's finally happening. And what's funny is I loved the movie. My mom the whole time is like, are you scared? Do you want to leave? And of course, I'm like, no, this is the greatest moment of my life. I'm seeing dinosaurs. So my poor mother is watching this like, oh, I kind of wish my kid wants to leave. I have to suffer through this. So thank you, Mom. You gave me a wonderful experience. But so the big draw for this was a lot of special effects and a well-known book. Michael Crichton is a well-known author. So again, we're seeing a trend. There is either a spectacle of, oh, you need to see this, the special effects are great, or there's something where it's like, oh, this is based on a book, this is based on a property that we know. And also Spielberg is a household name at this point, so his name had become synonymous with, if you want to see a good, well-directed blockbuster, we're going to see, you're going to get it from Spielberg. And the other thing that Spielberg, I think, does well with blockbusters more than anyone else is, and I think this is why his films endure so much, is he understands that at the core of these movies, it can't just be spectacle. We need to have some sort of a connection to these characters. We need to care about the people on screen. And be it Jaws with the dinner scenes with him and his kid, or the scene with them on the boat where Cooper's discussing being on the Indianapolis, or just the little moments with Elliot and E.T., Elliot trying to explain Star Wars with his figures, or in Jurassic Park where you have just the banter between Ellie and Alan. There are humans at the core of all of his films, and he knows how to get all of the humanity out of the spectacle. So you're not only getting a movie that is fun to watch, you are getting a movie that endears itself to you. And I think that's really why his films continue to not only endure, but during this period when he really was at the height of his game, just continue to get people to go see them. Because they're like, oh, we're not just being entertained, we're actually having an emotional connection to this. So over 400 million, adjusted for inflation, 825 million. We're gonna see Jurassic Park again, although unfortunately, the movie itself is not going to be as great. 94, we finally see a children's film rule the summer. And so think about this, 1975 to 94, that's 19 years. Compared to what we are going to see in the aughts and the 2010s, the idea of back then, the idea of a children's film being the #1 movie was a little unheard of, and especially considering Disney had been in such a slump. It had built its brand back at this point. It had The Little Mermaid. Beauty and the Beast was nominated for Best Picture, which is I believe until 2009, the only animated film to be nominated for Best Picture. And it had Aladdin, which not only was a big hit financially, but a big hit culturally. So it has The Lion King. And this is also the first movie they did that wasn't based on a fairy tale. And I know there might be some people out there to go, Kimba the White Lion, but that hasn't been proven that that's the inspiration for this. So Disney's first #1 hit, the first of many. Domestic gross, $422 million, adjusted for inflation, $800 million. And we will see The Lion King again soon. 96, this was another big blockbuster experience for me on a personal level. I believe a lot of people saw the Super Bowl spot, which just featured the White House being blown up by the spaceship. This was also the big star-making role for Will Smith, and Will Smith actually had a hit in 97 as well for the summer with Men in Black. So over 300 million for its domestic gross. This is also, again, I rewatched this movie as I do every year for July 4th. There's certain things that strike me about it. Vivica A. Fox's character she is a stripper, and she is someone who is seen as helpful, she's heroic, she's smart, she's seen as a good mother. And I wonder, I'm like, would this have happened now when the target age group is teenagers and not people in their 20s and 30s? And I mean, I guess we'll never know too much, but it's an interesting thing to look at what was acceptable in 90s blockbusters versus now, where they tend to be a bit more child-oriented. So we're gonna skip over 97, as I said. Men in Black won the summer, but we all know Titanic won the year and set a record for 12 years for box office gross. 98, this was the biggest shock I had researching this. So when I was looking at what would be the highest grossing film of the summer 98, I figured, oh, it's gonna be Armageddon, no question. Nope, Saving Private Ryan beat Armageddon by about $14 million domestically. Also had some other competition. It had the Godzilla remake, it had Deep Impact, and this was also the last time an R-rated movie was the #1 film of the summer. This also came at a time when I believe Band of Brothers had been published, and World War II was in a lot of people's public consciousness at this point. We had just had a few years earlier the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. And Tom Hanks, still a big box office earner. Steven Spielberg, still a big box office earner. If this movie were to be released today, it would likely be released in November, where all the other Oscar movies are released. But no, it was released in summer. So this is an interesting fact about Armageddon. If you were to go on Box Office Mojo and see what was the highest grossing movie for the year overall, it would be Armageddon. And that is because Armageddon's international total was higher than Saving Private Ryan's. And we are going to see this play more and more into what gets sequels and what gets made as we go into the aughts, because the foreign market is starting to become a lot more important to box office gross. Movies are one of our biggest exports. So 99, or as I call it, the year I learned disappointment. Phantom Menace, if you're a Star Wars fan, we all remember the excitement, and then we all remember, oh, this movie's not that good. I'm editorializing, obviously, I know, different opinions, but that was kind of the feel when it came out, was there was the hype over Star Wars returning, and then when you saw the reviews, the critical reviews were, yeah, this isn't great. Of course, that does not affect the box office gross, and it's still the 5th highest gross for any Star Wars movie. It had some solid competition that year. It had The Mummy, it had Wild Wild West. I think of all of them, The Mummy is best remembered that year. Also, in terms of blockbusters, the biggest success story of the year is not The Phantom Menace, but it is The Matrix. So The Matrix comes out. It's a rated R action movie directed by the Wachowski sisters, who had only had one real movie under their belt. Comes out in March, which is a dumping ground month, and it ends up breaking box office records for March at the time. So if you want to see the real success story of 1999, I would say look at The Matrix. So to end the year, these are the top grosses again. Batman won the summer for 92 and 95. Batman Returns did not win the year, though. Aladdin was actually the highest grossing film of 92, so we're starting to see Disney raise its dominance. And now we go into the aughts, which is where we really start to see the change in box office, not only in box office, because it gets bigger, but we're also seeing a change in what's made and what people are seeing. So as with the 80s and 70s, the target audience still seems to be 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds. Teens, if you can get them. That all changes with Shrek in 2001. So this is the first kids movie to dominate The Lion King since The Lion King to dominate the summer. And unlike The Lion King, it has a lot of jokes that the parents can get, which is what a lot of animation studios learned from this. Also won the first Academy Award for Best Animated Feature. $267 million didn't seem like much now, but it ends up setting the trajectory for where the box office goes and what studios decide to invest in, because we see, again, animation was kind of in a slump in the 90s as well if you were in Disney. And even then, Disney was working itself out of a 15-year pit. But Don Bluth just, his production company shuttered. There were a few other attempts at animated films that didn't do well. So with DreamWorks, we have kind of this snarky, winking at the camera kids movie, and not only does DreamWorks learn that can work, a lot of other studios that try to make kids movies do that as well. Even Disney kind of does it. 2002, we finally get another superhero movie other than Batman, and it's Spider-Man. So this is the first summer action movie after 9/11, and I mean, we were all alive for that. We all know the cataclysmic event that was. And Spider-Man was a movie that I know this sounds cliche, I think the society needed at that time. I think we needed the idea of this hero, especially in New York, someone who's going to do the right thing and try to save the day no matter what. It was a balm for the trauma we collectively as a society were feeling. And no shock to anyone, it grosses over $400 million. And this shocked a lot of people when it made money, but again, take into account, Spider-Man's been a known character for decades. Of course, there's a fan base behind it that's going to go see this movie. And also, this is the only time a Star Wars movie was released in the summer, and it was not the #1 movie of the summer. That is because the Star Wars movie was Attack of the Clones, and a lot of us were still pretty raw over The Phantom Menace. And honestly, Attack of the Clones isn't good either. It lost that spot on its own merit. So I'm kind of skipping over a lot of the aughts, but speaking of 9/11 movies, I do want to talk about Steven Spielberg's adaptation of War of the Worlds in 2005, because I would consider it the official post 9/11 or just 9/11 blockbuster. So if you know the story of War of the Worlds, it's the story of an alien invasion, told, if you read the novel, from the eyes of one man, kind of just trying to escape the destruction. I actually think overall this is a pretty decent adaptation of the book, which is at its core a travelogue. I think it does take a dive once Tim Robbins gets into the picture, but a lot of the anxieties and fears that people had, I think, are very well illustrated in this movie. You actually have, when all the destruction starts, one of the characters screaming, "Is this terrorism?" Which, you know, kind of where we were at the time. There, when the attack first starts and people are vaporized, you see Tom Cruise's character, he gets home, he sees that he's covered in dust. That's very reminiscent of the people who were covered in the World Trade Center dust. And you also have the character of the son who his only real reaction is, we have to do something and fight, which I think reflects a lot of people who enlisted post 9/11. So this was not the number one film of the summer of 2005. That was Revenge of the Sith. But I think if we're looking about post 9/11 blockbusters and post 9/11 movies, I think this is the most interesting one. And again, I think it's also because Steven Spielberg was working with it and he understood, like, again, this can't just be a spectacle. There has to be an emotional core to it. So moving on to 2008, A Tale of Two Superheroes. So this is, if you were to go back and tell me in 2007 that, like, oh, hey, Marvel is going to come to dominate the movies next year, I'd be like, you're crazy. The only one everyone really cares about is Batman. Oh, how wrong we were. So Dark Knight and Iron Man were both released. Iron Man was May, Dark Knight was July. So Dark Knight won the summer. And Dark Knight also had, again, sequel to Batman Begins, which came out in 2005. And while it wasn't number one, it made a lot of money. And it kind of rehabilitated Batman, which had suffered very badly after Batman and Robin. And it also had, I think, a more morbid spectacle to it, which was Heath Ledger's performance of the Joker. If you're not aware, Heath Ledger passed away when the film was in post-production, and there was still a lot of buzz over his performance, but there was kind of this idea of, like, it's the final performance of Heath Ledger. There were also rumors that, like, this performance drove him insane, so there was kind of a more ghoulish quality. People wanted to see, oh, did this really drive him crazy? But still, Dark Knight ends up winning the summer, but Iron Man wins the cultural war. So we're looking at the top movies of the aughts. We have Mission Impossible 2, Tom Cruise, John Woo, pretty serviceable action movie. We have Shrek. We have Spider-Man. 2003, we have Finding Nemo, another children's movie. 2004, Shrek 2, another children's movie. 2005, Star Wars. 2006, Pirates of the Caribbean. 2007, Spider-Man 3. 2008, The Dark Knight. 2009, Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen. I've only seen one of those movies. Once was enough. If you like them, it's fine. But I think the Transformers movies and Pirates of the Caribbean kind of exemplify the spectacle over the emotional core. And if you look at the box office gross for their international grosses, they are even higher than they are here. So movies like Pirates of the Caribbean and Transformers, they actually have made more money overseas than they do domestically. So that is why we have 5 to 6 Transformers movies. That's why we keep getting Pirates of the Caribbean sequels, even though no one stateside seems to care anymore. So we're starting to see the choices for what gets produced being driven by not only domestic choices, but foreign choices as well. So we are going to just kind of look over the 2010s. So we have Toy Story 3, Harry Potter, Deathly Hallows Part 2, The Avengers, Iron Man 3, Guardians of the Galaxy, Jurassic World, Finding Dory, Wonder Woman, Incredibles 2, and Lion King, the remake. So what are we noticing about all these movies? What are we seeing as a trend?
Franchises.
Yep. Franchises are known properties. So what studios took away from the 80s with stuff like Star Wars and Indiana Jones and Terminator 2, movies that will do well and continue to do well, it kind of kicks into overdrive in the new millennium, where, especially post-recession, studios become a lot more risk averse, and they're not as willing to invest in a movie where they don't think there is a guaranteed return on investment. So some of this is audience choice, but a lot of it is also what studios are putting out and what they're making. And some of it is kind of a symbiotic relationship. Like, we wouldn't have all of these movies if people didn't keep going to see them. But at the same time, if that's all that's available, what are you going to see? If that's all that's there at the multiplex. If you notice, so two things I want to point out. 2012, we have The Avengers, which, again, that was only the second Marvel movie to win the summer after Iron Man. They had already had stuff like Captain America. They had Thor. It seems, unthinkable now, but Avengers was considered risky by the MCU. This idea of, okay, we are going to have this team-up movie where you will have had to have seen these other films to have a full picture as to what's going on. And it ended up not only being watchable, but winning the summer. That was also, it had competition from Dark Knight Rises, which was the Batman movie, which that one unfortunately had the very early connotation of the Aurora shooting. I do wonder how much that had an effect on its box office, but I think it might have scared a few people away. And then if you look at 2008, you've noticed that I'll include The Incredibles 2 and Avengers Infinity War, and I'll include the Lion King remake and Avengers Endgame. So the reason I'm including them both is because some people don't consider Endgame and Infinity War to be summer movies because they came out in April. But I think this actually leads into a larger discussion as to what the MCU is doing and the effect that it's having on blockbusters and cinema in general, which leads us to the MCU blockbusters and you. So I think regardless of what you think of the MCU and if the movies are good or not, I'm personally with Martin Scorsese. I think they are the cinematic equivalent of theme parks, but at the same time, what's wrong with a theme park? I just think they can't be the only part of your cinematic diet. But I think the idea of having a 10-year-long cinematic experiment to have fans go to multiple movies and then have it all coalesce into one film. It's not like a James Bond film where it changes movie to movie. It hits the reset button. It is a continuous franchise. I think it is a grand experiment, and I do give the people at Marvel and Disney credit for that. But it is, I think, having a danger of sort of dominating the culture. So, and they're also, what they're doing is they're kind of becoming year-round, it's a year-round blockbuster machine. Not so much now, but especially in the 2010s, you'd have an MCU movie in the summer, you'd have an MCU movie in the fall, you might have an MCU movie in the spring. They would release multiple movies a year. Black Panther was the #1 film of 2018, and that was released in February. In fact, there was a piece by Scott Mendelson from Forbes where he said, the fact that Black Panther is just bulldozing over every mid-budget movie is scaring studios because they're starting to think like, a lot of studios are saying, okay, if all the big budget blockbusters are in summer, I'm going to schedule my mid-budget event movie for March. It'll be safe there. But if MCU's like, I'm putting one here and here and here, it's just bulldozing the competition. So it's this idea of, oh, great, we can't plan our movies for at any point in a year. So, we'll see where it goes from here. The MCU after Endgame is definitely kind of hitting a reset button. And especially now with the production halt, it's going to be a few years before we see another MCU movie. Or is the Eternals coming out? I'm not sure. I don't think we know when any movie's coming out anymore. Black Widow, we don't know when that's coming out, and that was scheduled for May, but that was back when we thought we'd go to movies. So speaking of, when are we going to go to movies again? What happens now? This is the first summer without a blockbuster since 1975, or I should say more accurately, since 1980. So since 1980, there has always been like a big movie of the summer, and we don't have that this year because of COVID. And there were a lot of films that were slated to be big films of the summer. We had Black Widow scheduled for May. Wonder Woman was scheduled for July, as was Tenet, which for me, that's the biggest disappointment because I love Christopher Nolan. And I'm excited to see a blockbuster that's not based on a pre-existing franchise. But we're kind of it's a lot of studios are trying to figure out what to do. the studio that's Warner Brothers has decided we are holding on to Tenet until theaters are open. Wonder Woman has, as of right now, it's being released. They hope in theaters in October, but we don't know. That might get pushed back again. And Disney decided to release Mulan on Disney Plus exclusively for $30. And that is an experiment as well. There might be people who think, I'm not paying $30. I can rent a movie for $10 in my home. But we saw Trolls, the children's film, make a ton of money in video on demand, but that had the extra effect of it was quarantine and a lot of parents needed something to distract their kids. The one, I think, bright spot of this is there are a few theaters open now. There are drive-in theaters. Where I live, there is a theater called Chunky's that is a dinner and a movie theater, so it's actually very easy for them to enforce distancing, just remove tables and chairs. And there has been a resurgence of repertory screenings and reissues. Reissues were a thing that went away in the 1980s with the advent of VCRs and VHS. So the fact that we're having Jaws on screen, people can experience Jaws on screen again, is, I think, a really great thing. And I believe a couple weeks ago, The Empire Strikes Back was the #1 movie in America. And there is such a push towards just watching it all at home. But I think, if anything, the fact that we're seeing people go to the theater to watch older movies shows that there are still a lot of people who like the cinematic experience. And that's one of the fun things about watching not just a blockbuster, but any film. It's the idea to experience a movie with someone and also to be, completely enraptured by a film. I mean, I am only speaking personally, but if I watch a movie at home, I'm checking my phone, I'm getting up, versus, I watch Jaws in a theater, my eyes are on the screen the whole time, and I'm actually noticing things I didn't notice before. So the one thing I can hope is, #1, movies eventually come back because I enjoy the theater experience. But I do hope that the public remembers the magic of going to a theater and the magic of experiencing movies with people. For every bad experience, I think there's a good one. So I'm just going to end on this, though. Final thought. This is from Spielberg, and this is from a great book. I believe I read it sophomore year of college. So it's from Blockbuster, How the World Stopped Learning and Learned to Love Summer. Times have changed, says Spielberg now. It's like the first 747s landed in the airport. Everyone thought flying through the sky was the greatest marvel. Today, we never even look at 747s. They're a dime a dozen. And that's what it's like as a blockbuster. So while there still is only one film that can win the summer, we are seeing a lot more high budget, high spectacle films, definitely since the aughts. And it's, there's a lot more competition now. So I'm going to ask, does anyone have any questions? Or comments? Do you have a favorite blockbuster?
I just have a question.
Sure.
Just curious as to what your thought is are moviegoers' expectations now changing for what they expect for a blockbuster? Like, if it's not an Avengers Endgame, is it worth my money to go see, or just wait for it to come out on video?
I think in many cases that is correct. Studios like familiarity, but I think audiences do as well, or at least they do now more so than they used to. I had actually taken a friend to see Jaws this year. She had never seen it before. And something she mentioned to me, she goes, there's so much downtime. There's a whole bunch of talking in this. But she then said, then again, I think I'm just used to how action movies are now. And that has been a huge change in blockbusters. Blockbusters back in the 80s and even in the 90s, there was a lot of time for character development, conversation. There were quiet moments in there, like even Terminator 2, which is jam-packed with action. There are a lot of moments where you're just getting character moments, versus you look at something like Avengers Endgame, and there aren't too many quiet moments in there. And I do think that has changed people's expectations, but I think it might also depend on age and what your consumption is. So if you do watch older movies, you might be used to, like, oh, some blockbusters are like this or some blockbusters are like that. But because, we're so used to Avengers now, I do think there is kind of an idea of like, I'll stick with what's familiar. I also think, and this plays into me with me sometimes, cost is an issue as well. They're like, oh, it costs so much to go to a movie, so I know I'll like Avengers movies versus I don't know if I'll like, say, Pacific Rim, so I'm not going to go see Pacific Rim. We all should have seen Pacific Rim. But yes, I think I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I definitely think you are onto something in that expectations have changed. I think a lot of people, especially younger people, expect wall-to-wall action versus someone older, like I think I'm in the middle group, kind of gets a little tired with being bombarded with spectacle. I think that's why I didn't like the Transformers movies, because I'm like, this is all spectacle and I don't care about who any of these people are. So thank you for your question. Anyone else?
I was just kind of curious about what you thought if there should be like a separate term for the big budget movies that started coming out in December post Titanic and Lord of the Rings.
Ooh. I mean, I think blockbuster is still, I think that technically qualifies, but I mean, maybe a spectacle picture perhaps, but I don't know. I would consider them blockbusters. I just think that for whatever reason it is, studios are more apt to release blockbusters that aren't action oriented in the fall. And I think some of that is more, they know that people expect the Oscar style movies to come out in the fall, so they're more okay with it. So, again, personal opinion. Anybody else? Does anyone have a favorite blockbuster movie or a favorite blockbuster experience?
Well, I went to see this movie called Pacific Rim at a Kineticon, and it was really good because the audience was cheering every single hit. It was really good. I don't know who I saw that with. Probably some losers.
Someone was going to beat me to it. Damn it.
I hate to say it. I think it has the makings of a blockbuster, but since it wasn't number one, I don't know if I can qualify it, but I'll allow it. In this case, I'll allow it. For me, I have to give it to Jurassic Park because I think, again, that is my ground zero for a greater appreciation of film. So with that, I would like to thank you all for watching. Next month, I'm going to be discussing political cinema, if that's your thing, and we're going to be looking at films all over the world and topics as well, from history to the media. And I would just like to say, have a good night. And these are my personal favorite blockbusters of the 2010s, Pacific Rim and Mad Max Fury Road. Great movies, watch them if you have not. And I would like to thank you for coming.
Witnessed.
All right. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Have a good
Hey.
night.